Friends, thank you so much for your patience and welcome to St. Paul's Cathedral. I'm Tricia Hillis, I'm the Canon Pastor here, and we are delighted that you can join us this evening. And we hope that you know that you are always welcome here in this cathedral space. Indeed, for those of you who might work locally, we'd love you to know that the cathedral is open from early on for quiet reflection in the mornings, which might just be perfect for those times when the commute has been a little frantic, but also for evensong at 5 p.m. So if you should find yourself wanting to step out of your office for a few moments of musical and reverent thinking space, do think of us. But it feels really fitting to us that we're holding this discussion and debate in this particular historic room. It's where Sir Christopher Wren is buried. His tomb is inscribed with a Latin phrase, non sibi sed bono publico, not for his own profit, but for the public good. And it is for the public good that we hold this kind of conversation here. Through the St. Paul's Institute, we're seeking to engage with our community in the city, exploring questions around morality and ethics, particularly as they relate to human flourishing and the common good, and through the lens especially of finance, business, democracy, and the economy. It is our vision that this cathedral will regain and keep hold of its ancient role, a place for public discussion and debate. Tonight's event is part of that. It's part of our Democracy and the Common Good series. That's a national conversation that's underway, which seeks to emphasize the value of the common good as we look about the opportunities and the anxieties that face our society. Turning to our specific topic for this evening, a quote. "The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income." Words from the Nobel Prize-winning economist Simon Kuznets in 1934. He was one of the architects of GDP, the monetary value of the measure of the value of goods and services produced by a country, and commonly used as a comparator for nations' economic performances. He, one of the people who designed the system, recognized its limits, suggesting that perhaps it doesn't simply tell us the whole story. We're going to hear tonight from friends at Christian Aid, our partner in this event, and from experts in economic research and the government's civil society strategy. We're going to consider how best to build an economy that's based on sustainable and ethical wealth creation. You're welcome, and indeed you are encouraged, please, to share your thoughts this evening. This is not a one-way or an exclusive conversation. So if you would like to, and we hope you will, please do consider using the Twitter hashtag, which is #measuringgrowth, and also use our space for questions and discussion, which will happen in about 45 minutes' time. We're delighted that Christine Allen, who's Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Christian Aid, will moderate the discussion this evening. And I'm particularly delighted now to hand over to our friend, Amanda Mukwashi, who is the Chief Executive of Christian Aid. Would you please join me in welcoming Amanda?
I feel very short. Okay, thank you so much, Tricia, for that welcome. I've been to St. Paul's Cathedral before, but I didn't come down here, so I didn't realize that you had such a beautiful and large premises. But let me just start by saying thank you for inviting me. And I'm really privileged, I think, because on the panel with me are some specialists, some economists. And I have to say, when my team said to me, would you go and speak? I thought, I'm not an economist. What am I going to say? And so, to be true to myself, I like to describe myself as a development practitioner. And I also like to say that I'm a village girl, and therefore I like to tell stories, because I grew up on stories. And so if you allow me this evening, as I speak to the subject that we're talking about, I would like to speak as a village girl telling stories. Over the last 6 months since I joined Christian Aid, one of the things that I told myself was, go and see the work that the organization does. Go and try to understand the impact on the affected communities, so that when you speak and when you try to bring about change in the organization, then you're actually doing so from the lived realities of those that are affected by inequality, injustice, and the loss of dignity. And so it's from some of these trips that I have made, and some of the individuals that I have met, and some of the communities that I've visited, that I tell you what I see, what I've learned, and hopefully something that's going to be useful in our debate. I went to Brazil a few months ago. Brazil is the 10th largest economy in the world and the biggest in Latin America. 2 decades of growth reduced absolute poverty, and so we had something to celebrate. But Brazil remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. About half the population receives 10% of total household incomes, while the other half holds 90%. And I could go on and give you statistics, but I'm not going to do that because I claimed right at the beginning that I'm not an economist. But what I saw when I went there, I was in Sao Paulo, was that there were so many homeless people, the working poor, people who actually had jobs but unable to afford any housing. They were on the streets with their children, and they were coming together to mobilize to try and address what they saw as an injustice. The impact, the trickle down that had been expected had not reached some of the most marginalized in Brazil. Massive inequalities mean that social groups such as Afro-descendants remain excluded. Gender-based violence is highest in Latin America, and Brazil is not exception to that. And as I spoke to individuals, we went into their homes, they invited us in really, really small places where they said, come in, come and see where we live so that you can understand, whether it's on the streets or it's in a little box. We want you to really understand what our life is about. What became clear to me was that economic growth, despite the steady rate with a few blips and hitches, had not actually translated itself into the lived realities of quite a lot of people, millions of people in Brazil. One more thing that I heard and I saw, speaking to the churches, and also to some of our partners who work with indigenous peoples in the Amazon. What was very clear is that although the Amazon is home to indigenous people, that belt is also attractive for economic activities, whether it's dams, whether it's electricity, the different activities that contribute to wealth accumulation. But the impact of it, in terms of displacement, and the impact of it, not just on people, but also on planet, remains unconsidered, and I choose that word quite deliberately. From Brazil, before that, I had gone to Bangladesh, and so if you can just come with me to Bangladesh, I met about 10 human rights defenders from the Dalit community. And I'm originally from Zambia, and in the Southern African region, we have the San people, or the Basara, or other people might know them as the Bushmen. But, you know, the indigenous group of people that somehow are, excuse me, seem to always be excluded out of mainstream economic activity. But when I met the Dalits, the human rights defenders, I have to say that it gave me food for thought. I had to stop. These were the 10 young people that I met. Some of them were trying to get an education. Christian Aid and our partners were working with them to really try and see how we could support them to self-actualize. And yet, when they shared their stories with me, they still talked about moving around with their own glasses and their own caps in the bags. Because when they went to meet with the central or devolved government, they were not allowed to drink from the same cups because they were not quite equal. Bangladesh is considered a developing country. Almost a third of its 150 million people live in extreme poverty. In the last decade, the country has recorded GDP growth rates above 5% due to development of microcredit and the garment industry. And so when you look at GDP and where Bangladesh is, you see that you would assume that it's growing. And if you're a village girl like me, you would assume that that would then translate in terms of benefits realization to everybody. But it doesn't quite work that way. For the 6 million Dalits, economic growth will not necessarily reach them, nor translate into a life of dignity. They are not considered equal or deserving of equal benefits. Every day, people will walk down the streets of Dhaka and never look back or even think about who keeps the streets or the sewer systems clean. The Dalits are unseen. The economic system doesn't recognize them. They are overlooked from sight and mind. Caste and occupation-based discrimination remains one of the most severe and forgotten human rights abuses of the 21st century. The Dalits in Bangladesh face various forms of discrimination and challenges due to their social status. The majority live in poverty, receive poor wages, experience segregation in various forms, including rigid occupation, have less access to basic amenities, and have lower levels of education and literacy. If the economy, and therefore economic growth, is a system by which wealth is created and used, then the lived realities of billions of people on the planet suggest that the system has either malfunctioned and needs revisiting, or perhaps it needs an overhaul. So that's my background. That's my story. That's where I'm coming from. I could tell you story after story after story that is not folklore, that is not a myth, but that tells you about the lived realities of people in countries where a pursuit for economic growth and an understanding of the success of economic growth models has meant that actually so many people's lives are not touched positively. Christian Aid is informed by a theology of vision of human flourishing. We start off on the basis that everybody was created equal. There are no second-class citizens in God's kingdom. We are all equal and deserving of dignity. I was trying to think about how am I going to talk about the theology behind, in a way that it's not just me reading, but me talking about what I really try to understand about what the Bible tells me. And so I was reading the Beatitudes. And do you know, I've always looked at Matthew 5, the first sort of 9 verses that, that talk about, in terms of the Beatitudes, as if you don't do this, then this is what will happen. If you don't do, I've always seen it very much in black and white. And then I've heard a lot of preachers talk about it almost like a justification for you to be poor, for you to be left out. But I was looking at it, and I thought to myself, I don't think this is what Jesus Christ meant. I think when you look at that and really try to analyze it and connect it with other scripture, what you realize is that he was speaking to the characteristics of the world that he would like us to live in. The characteristics of equality, equity, dignity, compassion, mutuality, collectivity, that we are one group of people. And that if we're to flourish, then it's not just the money element of us. It's the mind, it's the body, it's the soul, it's the planet that we've been given custodian on. And that we cannot survive one without the other. As human beings, we depend on the planet, and the planet needs us to also flourish. And so we need to find that equilibrium. That means that, our progression, our evolution, our development as human beings is not one at the expense of millions or billions of other people, and it's not at the expense of the planet. And once I finished thinking my way through that, I thought to myself, yes, the theology behind we were all created equal, and God has put us in here to flourish. I have come so that you might have life and you might have it abundantly. My understanding of abundance is not just money. I'm finishing now. I don't know who's keeping time, but okay. So based on that, Christian Aid really believes that when we look at poverty, therefore, it's multidimensional. It is not just one, it's not a linear thing. And it's not just about income poverty. It's not just about education. It's not just about access to health. It's about well-being. I was listening to one of the programs on BBC over the weekend. I think it was BBC, but it could have been Sky or another channel. And they were talking about the changing nature of medicine. And that when you go to visit your doctor and you say, I'm not feeling well, and you say, there's this that's wrong with me, the questions they now ask you is, what is your diet like? What do you eat? What is your day like? Tell us about what you do. And I guess they do that because we are learning more as humanity. We're getting more knowledge. And part of that knowledge is the understanding that it's not as easy as I've got an earache and therefore you give me something for the ear. That actually there's a whole person that is existing. And these things all come together. And I think you can take that from the individual to the collective. And so when you look at what we mean in terms of multidimensional element of poverty, it also requires a multidimensional approach to solution finding. We also believe that poverty is not natural. It is political. It is because of the political choices that those decision makers, those that are in positions of authority, make. So, like I said, I'm originally from Zambia. The times of structural adjustment programs in Zambia was a very difficult time for Zambians. I am glad in terms of lessons learning that I lived through it, and so I can speak from having stood in that position and having walked through it. I stood on the queue with a coupon because money didn't buy anything at that point to try and get food for us to eat at home. Yeah. And so it's really important to understand the role of decision makers, whether they're politicians or whether, as we know, it's no longer just those that are in positions of power in terms of the elected, it's also the multinationals, it's the business sectors that all intersect to actually, I think, to what I would call to pursue and perpetuate a system of a global economy that is really driven by wealth accumulation for a few at the cost and expense of the majority. And I would gladly would welcome to hear something that is different when all evidence actually speaks to the contrary, when all evidence shows us that clearly, if it has been working, why do we still have millions of people in extreme poverty? Latest reports have told us that over 800 million people are now going to be left behind unless we do something that is different. I've run out of time, but I'm hoping that I'll have another chance to speak. So let me just end by saying this. Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was asked about human rights, she was asked where human rights started. And there's a famous quote that quite a number of you might know, where she said that unless human rights have meanings in the small households, where it might even be very difficult to count, where you won't find them on the maps, unless they have meaning there, then they'll have meaning nowhere. I want to say this evening that for economic growth to really have meaning, unless it can have meaning, positive meaning, in the lived experiences of the small households in the smallest villages and the smallest places, for those people that are marginalized and excluded, then economic growth has outlived its welcome, and it's time for us to find an alternative to place on the table. Thank you.
That's very powerful. Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm sure you've got lots of questions. Hold on to them for a little while, because I'm going to have a bit of a conversation with my two very esteemed guests here before we bring a couple more people in. So I'm extremely pleased to welcome Professor Jagjit Chandra and Danny Kruger. Their biographies are in your panel, but Jagjit's professor splitting his time between Kent and Cambridge?
No, I only run the institute now.
Oh, you just run the institute. I'm so sorry.
It's more than a full-time job.
I bet, absolutely. But with a strong background with the Bank of England and also being a special advisor to the Treasury Committee. So we've got a lot of experience. And Daniel, yourself, you're an expert advisor to the Department of Culture. You're a chair of a local criminal justice charity called Only Connect, and has been a special advisor to David Cameron in opposition, so don't hold him responsible for Brexit. So you have to have a Brexit joke in sometimes. But we've heard a huge amount from Amanda. I'm going to start with you, Professor Jagjit. You know, we've heard GDP. I mean, Amanda's kind of like told a bit of a death knell there. You know, is it really working? But why do we use it? It's got quite a considerable foothold in terms of the way in which we consider our economy.
Well, let me first thank you for inviting me here this evening, and I can't say how much I enjoyed Amanda's talk. I think it was impassioned, caring, and everything you'd want from someone who was running Christian Aid. I think it's a remarkable set of points that she raised, and it's very hard to challenge them in any way. So you've given me a very hard task. I think today is a remarkable day to have chosen to have this debate about GDP. I would imagine that someone told you from up there that this was the right day to talk about this. On Sunday, the European Union and Britain decided upon the form in which it would leave the European Union. The Institute produced the first analysis, that's my institute, of the impact on GDP from that leaving. Earlier today, the set of government economists produced their impact, and about 2 hours ago, the Bank of England produced their impact study as well. And they've all come up with very similar numbers in terms of the impact. So if I could just spell the number out, and then maybe we can use that as a point of departure to think about what GDP means. But I'll just cut me off. I'll try and do this in 2 or 3 minutes. So
good. Cool.
The basic analysis suggests that leaving the European Union will leave us around 3% on average per person worse off than the alternative of staying in the European Union. It doesn't mean we're poorer. It just means if there's a line going up in time, the line from leaving the European Union on average, per person on average, is about 3% lower, which translates in current income terms to about £1,000 per person. So what does that mean if I tell you that GDP is going to be 3% lower at some point in the future? Is it the whole story? Does it capture the anxiety? Does it capture the impact on the economy? Does it capture the particular impact on a region or a particular area that's producing goods for whom there will now be substitutes in Europe and from which people will lose their jobs? Will it capture the impact on our defence? Will it capture the impact on our intellectual property? Will it capture the impact on the City of London? It cannot. It's very much like a thermometer. It's telling you something about the temperature of the economy. It's telling you it's going to be a little bit cooler than it would otherwise be. And if I could use the analogy that Amanda put forward, there's a lot of other things we need to measure to understand the state of the economy.
So why are we so obsessed with it? What is it?
Well, to the extent to which it is a first part, I mean, I try to avoid going to the doctor, I'll leave it to others, but the first thing they often do is take your temperature. So it's a first pass. It's a statement of where we are in terms of production, expenditure, and income in the economy. And it's a good way of understanding a particular position. But what we don't do well enough is understand or decompose that aggregate number into the implications for different types of households across the distribution, for different regions, and in different industries. Now, part of that is our own fault in that we have limited patience. We'd rather go back to the internet or whatever we do in social media. It's partly my fault as an economist and my peers in not spending time explaining that underpinning that aggregate number are a lot of other numbers that add up to compose that particular number, and you need to understand what it means for you. It was a famous response to someone who said at the time of the referendum, I think it was in Newcastle, if you leave the European Union, said one of the Remain campaigners, your GDP will be lower. And this chap in Newcastle, I won't attempt to do a Geordie accent, said, that's your GDP, not mine. And that's a classic statement of inequality, or the sense in which there may be regional disparity, or something that is not being captured by that particular number. It doesn't mean it's not there. It's all there. It's all added up to that number. But it's not presented and doesn't necessarily give us a chance to think about it.
And we know that inequality is not picked up. I mean, we heard it very strongly from Amanda. I mean, both inequality between different communities and regions, but also, I think, the inequality in terms of wealth inequality. So what else can we use? Is there something different there?
Well, you can measure inequality in income and inequality in wealth. And unfortunately, if you look at the inequality in income, it hasn't deteriorated very much in the last 30 years. There's just the same level of inequality we had 30 years ago. That doesn't mean I'm happy with the level of inequality I had 30 years ago. But the wide perception that it's deteriorated is in fact not right. And one of the reasons it hasn't deteriorated in the last 10 or 15 years, we've had minimum wage legislation that has raised the wages for people on low salaries and provided higher levels of employment. So in fact, against the grain of the information we often receive by people who just look at America and imagine that also goes on here, we haven't had the decline, a deterioration in income inequality. And we had throughout the 20th century a very large reduction in wealth inequality as more and more of us started buying our own property. The prime determinant of wealth equality is the extent to which you own property or not. That's not to say it's a bad thing for people who don't own it, but actually throughout the 20th century, as more and more households bought their properties, wealth inequality fell on a secular level throughout that period. So when you look at the numbers, it can surprise you as to the popular, and I tend to use the phrase man in the pub, but I mean person in the pub, and I may not even mean pub.
Yes, or person in the food bank,
yeah.
Of which we've seen a massive...
Well,
I kind of feel that we may be reaching a hockey stick in terms of some of the statistics. But I'm gonna move to Danny now, to move from the sort of national to a much more community level and a much more kind of local level. Do you recognise, do you see, from your own experience and from at a community level, resonances with what Amanda was saying here in Britain?
Yes, thanks. So thanks again for having me as well. So just as explained in the introduction, I work as an advisor in government now, but for 10 years I've been doing work in London with prisoners and ex-offenders and with children and young people at risk. So working with civil society organisations, the charity I set up and others to to try and act both remedially with people for whom life has gone very badly wrong, offenders and ex-offenders, and preventatively with children at risk. And the story of that 10 years has been very instructive to me. We've definitely seen a growth in all sorts of forms of social responsibility. I don't think one fault that I think David Cameron allowed people to think is that he thought the big society was new. Of course, there's nothing new about communities stepping forward and taking responsibility for themselves and each other and working collaboratively. This is an ancient British tradition, but it has grown over the last 10 years as the state has had to face the fact of massive fiscal retrenchment. The story of austerity, of cuts in public spending, has not fallen mostly on the big public services that the media are concerned about, health and education and so on, or even welfare. It's fallen on local government. And the main funder of local charities traditionally was the state, the council, and that isn't there in the same way anymore. And increasingly councils just act as funders of social care. And they do the very critical, high need work that is mandated by central government, and frankly the stuff that they have to do. So all of the stuff that we all recognise is so important around prevention, around investing in communities and in charities, community groups, faith groups, just isn't coming from the public purse anymore. And so what's happening instead is communities are stepping forward, and we see it obviously in the remedial sense with food banks, but we also see it, and increasingly, and I'm most excited by the way that we're having, I think, a sort of Victorian, I always try to get this into Cameron speeches, and they never wanted to sound like we wanted to bring the Victorian era back. But actually there is something inspiring about the Victorian model of philanthropy and civic and mutual self-help. It wasn't all rich people helping poor people, it was communities helping each other. And I just discern glimmers of this. So to speak positively, we've been speaking a bit gloomily about the state of the world. I think there is an amazing wind of change blowing through our society in which people are responding, many of them to the awful realities of life in our poorest communities, but stepping up in a really positive way. And I think the new model is one where the government, and this is what I'm trying to achieve in my advisory role, is an enabler of healthy, resilient communities. And the job of government is not just to come in and fix problems as they present themselves, or to just be the monopoly funder of public services, but it exists to strengthen the foundations of our communities and to make those communities more resilient, in the new word, healthy, strong, organically able to prevent problems developing and to respond when crisis hits. So that's what I'm seeing, is all this genuine distress, but also a new spirit of community self-help.
And do you think, thank you, Danny, because I think, Jagjit, do you think there's a sort of way in which that community spirit, that community resilience can be sort of monetised or included in a kind of GDP plus kind of way of doing things, or is it so totally separate?
Well, clearly there are many things that people value that aren't in GDP, law and order, the kind of community spirit that Danny's talking about. The question is whether they should be measured within some measure of the marketable production in activity. So a very good example of something that's not included that should be included is working at home, in a sense in which that's not included in the GDP statistics, but is clearly something that contributes to overall welfare. And it's something for which there's not typically an exchange of payment for, but nevertheless is something that is valued by people. So to think about the things that are valued, that would give us a better measure on the progress of society. But I think I would say more important than that would be to sort of to again go to the point I've already made, is to think about better statistics in terms of the regional poverty levels that we have, regional life expectancy, homelessness, the incidence of psychiatric problems. These are all important social measures that we don't necessarily have at the correct level of granularity to understand the problems that are faced. I agree with Danny that the impact of fiscal policy over the last 6-7 years has not been on the large aggregates. It's been pushed through local authorities in a particular way. But if we had more information on the problems in those areas, then that would be something that we could force policymakers to address. It would seem to me you don't necessarily need to correct the GDP numbers in there, but I think if you could, again, I go back to the point, really go down to the granular level and say, look, that fall in GDP has hit that bit of London very badly. It hasn't hit that bit of London. What are you going to do about it? I don't think we're seeing enough of that.
Okay, I think that's really helpful in terms of, what matters is what we measure, as it were.
Yes.
So we've heard, from your economic perspective, we've heard communities, and also, thank you, Danny, for bringing in the perspective in terms of local government. I'd like to move to business now, if I may, and introduce Cal Baliey to just speak very briefly. I'm a bit conscious of time, Cal. But Cal is a businessman. He's a director of NG Baliey, and he's also very active in the Church of England as a lay reader, and has been part of Christian Aid's, a really important part of Christian Aid's SALT network, which is a network for business people who are trying to put their values into practice, if you like. And Cal is someone who's been working very strongly to try and work in a sort of ethical and sustainable way. So I just want to ask you to maybe share a few points from your own perspective, Cal, from your work of trying to be doing economics differently, doing business differently within this debate. So.
Okay, thank you. I'll begin by saying I started as a business person here in London, training as an accountant, with the goals that most young people had, and I hadn't worked out any sort of Christian approach to that at all, and absorbed what was there and worked with it, and saw lots of my colleagues, especially those 10 years older than me, really getting hollowed out, might be a word. I'd use all sorts of words. I've seen it in the legal profession, I've seen it in the accounting profession, I've seen it now in business as well. People who frankly got bored with the primary goal being a budgetary goal every year. Those goals can still be difficult to achieve, so that bit's not boring, but somehow starting it all again on the 1st of January just doesn't excite the same level of interest it did 10 years ago, even if they're now running a bigger division or something. And I've seen that in myself too. And in our business, I had slightly more ability as a shareholder as well as a senior manager to begin to adjust the goals. We were just the same as other businesses. We're in the world of construction. It's a hard world. You have to fight for success on every single contract. But we started to adopt 2 goals instead of 1 in our business. And my simplified version of it when I was talking to our people was we had a profit goal, and our secondary goal was to be responsible as well. So profitability and responsibility became our 2 goals. And we defined what we meant by the responsibility goal. To begin with, we are in the electrical and mechanical world, and so we're doing the stuff in buildings that contributes to climate change. We're installing boilers and running heating systems and in the electrics. So I thought the primary thing we should do as a business was to, first of all, measure our own carbon footprint and then help clients reduce theirs. And we've done that. We've done it for some very big clients indeed, including some of the biggest land property owners in London. And that brings a very different feel in the business and a very different feel to executives who, to begin with, life's just got a lot more complicated. But it's certainly not boring. It's certainly not the same again as last year, only with higher numbers. And it gave a degree, I think, of interest and commitment, which I was delighted to see, as well as a degree of frustration and what's all this carbon we've got to measure suddenly. I think it gave them a new life, and I would certainly say it did that for me.
Thank you, Cal. It's fascinating. I'm just reminded about, Jagjit, your point about that sense of, well, if we disaggregate in terms of the figures, it gives us that information. Yes. And in some respects, the way in which GDP is used at the moment at that very, very top level ignores that, both denies the passion, but also it hides what we really need to focus in on. Yes. Do you think there's ways in which we can respond in practical terms around our GDP in the way that Cal's talked about?
So it's interesting that Cal's talking about that. One of the things for example, the Institute and other areas is to get people to think about their own particular field. We have people working on macroeconomics, people working on social policy, quantitative labour and migration. And within their own budget plans, I also ask them to think of a plan for the whole institute as well. So they're supposed to think about doing things that helps the institute and the public good of what we're trying to do. So people to have what I call a sort of joint utility function as well as their own domestic utility function. So that's an interesting analogue with running what we do. But if I go back to your point, how can we get GDP to deal with things that aren't currently measured in there that we think are part of the production function? And of course, one of the ways is to think about taxes for carbon out emissions in a particular way that will allow us to measure the amount that we use, and also possibly lead those to detracting from output if it's not done in a sustainable manner. And these are things in which towards which many people are thinking of particular answers to. So I think at times what we're really arguing for is that a GDP that is running faster and yet is depleting scarce resources more quickly is a less valuable GDP than one might be growing less quickly but not depleting national resources. And there's a lot of work in economics that to be proud of that's trying to do exactly that. Hasn't yet transferred itself into direct measures of GDP. And one other point, if I may, is that it also applies to fiscal policy. So currently when we think of fiscal policy, it's definitely just in terms of the overall deficit on the fiscal position or the overall surplus. But now we've got methods of looking at the whole of government accounts, all the assets government own. Be amazed to think about the value of land held, for example, by the defence industries, and the liabilities of government as well, which is the whole of the pension liabilities added up in a particular way. And if we're doing that properly across the whole of government, we get some very different positions as to the overall net worth of government and what it should be doing to address them, where government by itself becomes much more forward-looking than just thinking about a particular deficit today. It's saying, how can we set our fiscal policy to produce a series of net worth numbers that help people in the future as they age and they have shortages in their pensions.
And of course, that long-term agenda is absolutely critical when it comes to tackling climate change and being able to respond to our carbon footprint, as Amanda talked about, particularly in her experience. And Danny, from a kind of community-based perspective, that sense of being able to kind of, you know, the excitement and passion that Cal was talking about isn't found in money, and that's been exactly the same in terms of your experience too. It's something completely different.
And I think it's important what Jagjit just said about the whole of government accounts now being able to measure assets is so important, because in communities what matters is often assets, not wealth. And we naturally enough we worry a lot about income for community groups and for local government and so on, but actually the wealth that exists in local places is extraordinary. Often public sector assets sitting there idle or not being well used, which could potentially galvanise all sorts of really positive community action. I'm a great fan of asset transfer, of handing over public assets to community trusts, still held for the public, but then able to galvanise all sorts of positive social action. Can I just... So I'm very in favour of that whole agenda. I do think there's a concern, though, that we get into a sort of tyranny of numbers, and what we're trying to find here is a new way of measuring, a new calculation that can prove to the sort of number gods that this work is worth doing. And we can do that to some extent. ONS does it. You know, I've seen calculations that the value of unpaid work we mentioned is equivalent, if it was sort of monetised, if people were paid at the kind of appropriate rate for all the taxing of their children they do, all the housework they do, all the, you know, if you were paid to do the voluntary work you do, that it is equivalent to the paid work in the economy to GDP. And I'm sure that's right, that instinctively is right. We all do probably equivalent to the amount of work we're paid for, unpaid, or families do, you know, we do that. So we can do those sums, but then again, should we be pursuing this? And I just want to raise quickly, our department, DCMS, has just overseen the World War I commemorations. Huge job, incredibly expensive. I hope we didn't have to justify to the Treasury the value added that would generate for UK PLC. There might have been some small bit of protocol that would have to be done along those lines. What is the cost benefit and value of this work? But actually, the government decided to spend a lot of money doing something totally pointless from a GDP point of view, and I hope we all think that was worth doing. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. I'm conscious of this for DCMS. We do all the loads of arts, heritage, culture stuff. You know, we can prove its value to the economy, but and we can sort of quantify its value to people, but actually, should we be always trying to do that?
Yeah, I think that's a good challenge. Cal, final comment, and then we're going to bring us.
I want to suggest it's got far more to do. The economy is not everything. We haven't got. We shouldn't be. The Treasury should not be the sole arbiter of where money gets spent. Surely, what matters to us is one of the major things: the quality of our relationships. Amanda talks about the Dalits in Bangladesh. That's not our problem here, although no doubt we buy stuff that they may have made in pretty squalid circumstances. But what we do have here are relationships in supply chains, which are appalling. Our relationships with customers, which are appalling. Our relationships within our own teams, which might be pretty appalling. I've seen that in our business. I've seen that in lots of businesses. Surely the quality of the management we have, the quality of our leadership, they are things that have value in their own right, which are quite apart from economics. Yeah. And relationships in our families.
And are not subject to the number gods. I love that. So I'm going to bring Amanda in. And it's time to, I'm going to be a bit cheeky, and it's time to kind of just open it up to yourselves so that we become a little bit more of a panel. I'm going to try and have a bit of a conversation. Oh, there's a hand up already. Jodie is doing brilliant stuff in terms of questions and comment with the microphone. So questions and comments. Jodie, there's a person there. Is your protocol that people to just say who they are? So please do. Hello.
Hi, my name's Claire Jackson-Pryor. I'm with the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies. I've been interested listening to your conversations that no one has mentioned that many, many countries around the world actually have control of their own currencies. And as the professor will know there, as he's been working for the Bank of England, the way that government spending happens is that the money is created, issued into the system, and then taxed back out of it for inflationary purposes and to give value to money. What worries me in hearing all of you speak is that the power that is given to the people who run businesses, these big corporations, it comes from, a lot of it is the idea that they are the sole wealth creators at the top. They are providing the jobs and that allow us to pay taxes to pay for things, which isn't how it happens. And as long as we are under the impression that the government spending is the only important thing in the economy, then that is never going to change, and we're always going to be putting forward ideas that are trapped in the same what's the word?
Paradigm.
Oh, that's it. Sorry, I've done a bit of public speaking, but I'm still very nervous.
You're great.
I mean, what I wanted to ask is, what does the panel think of using something like the Gini coefficient instead of GDP or alongside it? Why don't we make more use of the sectoral balances approach, which shows the different balances between government deficits, external surpluses in this country, and what's happening in the non-government sector, the private sector, what's happening to households and businesses. Because as we see in a country like the UK, where we import more than we export, if the government doesn't run a deficit, then the private sector does. Yeah. And also on the topic of foreign aid and developing countries generally, what tends to happen is we go over there and we tell them that they've got to export, instead of helping them to use their own currency issuing powers to build up their own country's wealth for themselves, right, so that they can use what they already have more usefully for their own country. We want them to export and then import, and they end up with huge foreign currency debts, which are not the same as having a debt in your own currency.
Great, thank you. Lots of points there, Claire. Thank you so much. I think, so Jagjit, that's that challenge again about kind of, GDP, it's useful for some bits, but it doesn't for others. We've had stuff about different balances that Claire talked about, the happiness index and other things, so maybe have a reflect on that. And I kind of wonder whether, Amanda, there's something there from a Christian aid perspective about understanding the national interest, in whose interest we operate. Judge,
I'll give a very quick answer. There's a fallacy that is the government can print money and that makes wealth. That's not where wealth comes from. Absolutely clear.
No, it isn't.
It did sound like what you said.
The perception that
it did sound like that's
control.
what you said, and I'd be happy. So That's how I've interpreted what you said. It's not exactly how it works. The typical economy is about 20% government consumption, 80% private consumption. On top of that is about 20% of transfers. So in the UK, government expenditure, or total managed expenditure, is about 40% of GDP. The rest of it is in the private sector, and of course it's the government that's taxing the private sector, offsetting distortions where possible, and raising whatever revenues it can for public goods, such as law and order and defence. And that's how the economy is very essentially structured. So, and within the private sector, 2/3 of employment is in small firms, and all large firms started off as small firms once. So to think in your mind that people are thinking that the economy is run by a small number of people running very large firms is not, in fact, how most people think it's structured at all.
But there is
it's a dynamic process with a large number of firm births and deaths in every year that is helping productivity in the economy.
But Claire's point was about, this sense that the wealth creators are at the top, as it were, and then it's at this kind of like trickly down. And I think we were hearing a definite thing about a call for a different paradigm, a different way of looking at it. So, do you think that's realistic?
Let me take a step back. In the last 30 years, successive political parties have avoided the question of reforming our tax system to generate revenues. The position was taken some 30 years ago that you couldn't get elected in the UK if you started talking about changing taxes. So we've had a particular settlement that's decided where taxes will be meted. So very little on capital taxation, very little on housing wealth, and not very well integrated with the new industries that have developed over the last 25 years. So you've got a taxation system that doesn't actually match the structure of the economy very well at all. And what we need is some courageous politicians to reform that tax system, which, if I could finish, would then give us sufficient revenues to generate, think about solving some of the problems that the country faces.
Absolutely.
And that's a much deeper question and requires a bit more political courage than I think we've had.
I think that's a really good point. And Christian Aid, having got a bit of a track record on working on tax for the last 10 years or so, would wholeheartedly agree with you. And actually a lot of the general public would as well. I mean, in some of the polling that we've done as Christian Aid, asking people, what's your view around taxation? 4 out of 5 people have said they would not spend money or buy from businesses that evade tax or dodge tax, and they want the government to tighten things up. Of course, practice is something else, but that's another story. So, Amanda, could you any reflections there about, particularly from an international perspective?
Okay, thanks. I guess maybe just 2 points, 2 reflections from me. The first one is, I think you mentioned something about what we tell developing countries. There are 2 things. One, we take our own models to developing countries, and we want developing countries to adopt those models. And we might expect them to vary them a little bit here and there, but the principle is the same. Right? So if the model itself, and I guess this is what I was trying to say, if the model itself is faulty, then we are already taking a faulty model in environments that actually are not geared up for any model, really, in some extent. And there I'm being a bit pessimistic. The second element is, by and large, it comes with the national interests, right? And whether you look at the fact that OECD countries have refused for the United Nations, for example, to have a tax body that can really interrogate that taxation, right? That is out of national interest and self-preservation, right? Let me be a bit provocative here, and suggest that one of the key challenges of the current models of the economy, of defining what the economy is, what matters within the economy, what gets measured, is that actually, over generations, you can go back centuries, right? The model has always had one key driver at its heart, which is, for me to get better, and irrespective of what the cost is on you and your environment. That's, and yes, of course, it's changing slowly. We're seeing, some gains somewhere. I'll give you an example, which is something that Christian Aid has been working on. We've been challenging HSBC. Can I use that example? Yes? I will use it
You've
now.
done it.
Well, I've started. I might as well finish.
Don't be shy. They're big enough to take it. It's fine.
Yes.
Yeah.
On investing and supporting core power, right? And they're okay to say, yes, we'll stop investing in that in developed countries. But in some of the developing countries, we will continue. What is the driver for that? I guess my short answer to you, if I go round and round in circles, but my short answer is that our economic models were not designed, as far as I'm concerned, for what us as Christian Aid see the holistic approach to human flourishing. And that's why I said, do we need to, not redefine, because I think redefine is about tweaking at the edges, right? Do we need an overhaul of it? And I think we've got economists in our world, in this country, in other countries, that actually can put an alternative, but it's not an easy job. I mean, it's not easy because there are a lot of interests that will keep it in the way it is.
I'm going to go back to a question. Maybe take a couple this time. We've got one there and the man with the beard there. So if we could take you two.
Thank you. Hello. My name is Alexandra Konoplyanik. I work for an organization called the Philosophy Foundation, teaching critical thinking to children and adults in community and workplace. And my question is, we're talking about the alternatives to GDP, and there are examples elsewhere in the world of such alternative indexes, such as the Human Development Index of UN and the famous Bhutanese Gross Happiness Index. So I would be very interested to hear the opinion of the panel on those kind of initiatives and what we can learn from them.
Great, thank you. And the gentleman with the beard, thank you.
Good evening. My name is Matt Meyer. I'm working for an organization called the Economy for the Common Good. Jagjit, first I want to point out, it's very handy that you pointed out that inequality in the UK didn't massively change in the last 30 years. That's because it changed massively just in the 10 years before, in the 80s. And the Gini coefficient jumped by 30% during that time. Economy for the Common Good actually has a way to measure the impact or the contribution of a company towards the common good. My question to all of you is, can you actually imagine an economy that sets at its very purpose pursuing the common good and not pursuing growth? Because we're now living in a world where we cannot afford to pursue economic growth anymore. We now need to look at how we can take all this material wealth and make it more equal and more sustainable. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So Alexander's question about views on alternative indexes, and I think Matt's provocative thing about can we even imagine that kind of different way? So, Cal, from a business perspective, you've already started to try and think about things differently. How much space do you feel that you've had to be able to respond differently?
I'm very happy. I'm afraid I don't know the index you were talking about, so I can't comment on it. But I'm very happy to contemplate a world with a very different business model, and I jolly well think we should, because I think this one's a tired one, and it's not working for the people it needs to work for. Profit in business is our challenge. We are, as business people, trained to seek profit as a dog seeks food. And what my reflection on profit to a business is like air to an animal or a human. We need air to survive. That is not to say we spend most minutes of most days looking for air. It is not that... it is perfectly possible for businesses to pursue other goals. We just need to get used to a totally different world in which our boss asks different things of us, and so do the shareholders. Profit is no more than something we've got used to chasing, which we've got used to measuring, and which we've lost the imagination to find alternatives to replace or put alongside it. And I think we need to invent better worlds than we have and work hard to find them.
I mean, Danny, you talked before about resilient communities and the way in which people are kind of almost trying to imagine that. I mean, do you feel that there's the opportunity there?
Yes.
Are we brave enough to imagine something different?
Yes, and I don't think it's too difficult to imagine. And in fact, it's the old idea of business. Before we, it's a recent and modern idea that businesses exist to pursue profit. They never set up in that way. This is a new idea that the sort of fiduciary duty of the executive is to return profits to shareholders. Businesses exist for a purpose, which is to serve the public, and they need to cover their costs every year. And if they're returning making returns to capital investors, that's necessary too. But so I don't think it's a difficult thing to imagine. It's difficult to get there, I guess.
To do.
I mean, can I just speak up for growth as a concept? I don't think I worry a bit about the idea that growth is a problem in itself. Obviously, it's about what is growing. I mean, growth feels to me a very godly principle. Creativity, invention, building, cultivating, making more things where there were less things before feels to me like a noble pursuit for mankind, and sort of what we're here for in a way. The problem is when we fetishize it, make an idol out of the things, so abundance is good, but it's abundant life we're supposed to be pursuing rather than abundant possessions, and what the model of growth therefore should be one in which full, rich lives are pursued. I suppose the trying to imagine this, it's people talk about inclusive growth. I think there is a model that is a bit of a straw man. Not many people actually believe in it, but it has become the common practice, particularly of big corporations who are owned by shareholders who don't even know they own the company because of the way that ownership is split and sold and divided up, and ultimately we probably as pension holders might be the owners. But anyway, the ownership model makes it very difficult. But what we want, rather than companies and economies growing and then redistributing through national welfare policies, which actually often create further problems of their own, we should be seeking a model whereby the social good is fulfilled in the growth itself, in the practice of businesses we've been hearing about. And I really honour Jagjit's point about the long-term value of this sort of economy, because it might be that GDP or local growth is slower in the meantime, but long-term, I do think there's value in saying we'd like to see the economy grow over time. It's just how it's done and the purpose of all our activity not being all about growth, all about more money.
I guess I'm reminded of St. Oscar Romero, who said we're called not to have more, but to be more. So that sense of flourishing. But I think there is a question about that rather jargonistic thing of planetary boundaries, constantly having more, constantly growing more. We've raised the point about sustainability. So Jagjit, do you think from what we've talked about that I suppose it's that leap from imagining to putting into practice. But it feels to me that we have got lots of ideas. There are different indices. So what is stopping us kind of like from really changing GDP in a big way?
I'll just run through some of the points briefly that have been raised. On these new ways of measuring, the Human Development Index is particularly interesting because what you want from an index is scientific replication. So if you go to the same set of people, will you get the same result next time or a different result? The Human Development Index, because it's adding up things like life expectancy and variance in income and infant mortality and other things, is a sensible thing because we can compare across countries. Things when we're looking at happiness, I'm afraid I'm not at all interested in at all. It's subjective, it's not something that you can sample the same set of people on and look at them against economic outcomes and get something that an economist would call a consistent mapping from subjective views and outcomes. So I'm not terribly interested in that kind of stuff. The point about raising that there was no deterioration in the Gini coefficient over income over the last 30 years was not that there hadn't been a deterioration in the late 70s and early 80s. I lived through that period and I understand very well the extent to which that was associated with strife in this country. I was around and I know what it was like. You don't have to I certainly don't want to give a talk about the winter of discontent and my worry that we might be heading towards something similar at the moment, given everything that's going on politically. But my point was simply that those who've been talking about a deterioration in the last 5 or 6 years are missing the point that actually there hasn't been much of a deterioration over that period. So I apologize if I wasn't being clear on that point. It was only to do with people's observations on the recent past. I think in all of what we're talking about is we're talking about a second objective for policy. GDP may be a sensible way of thinking about income per head. We live in a world in which income per heads, for example, in the UK, have been doubling every 30 years or so. So I am twice as well off as my parents at their age, and I'm very pleased about that. And I've got things that they didn't have at their age. I also intend to live for longer. I'm lucky that they're still around. That's a benefit that they've got. I think whether we believe it or not, we do live in a safer country than it was in the period I've just described in the 1970s, with less violence and, believe it or not, fewer murders than we saw in the past. But all of that I'm talking about is good governance. And we need good governance in the developing world. Again, the relationships between transnational corporations and governments in developing countries is often the root of the problems in those countries. It's not GDP per se. It's certainly not economists trying to think about offsetting distortions. It's often the political and social failure in those economies that is itself not to do with GDP. It's about good governance. And if we can make a point about profits, that's also part of good governance. Profits that are generated by firms that have too much monopoly power don't necessarily need to be redistributed, they need to be regulated. We need monopolies and mergers commissions to act with teeth to break up these things when they can. That, it seems to me, is good governance. And it's completely consistent with continuing to measure progress in the economy by measures of output that are dealing with the amount that we're producing, but thinking very hard about minimizing inequalities, minimizing profit maximization in small numbers of industries where we can break it up, and providing an appropriate role for the state for regulating those industries. And where the regulation has failed, we should think again. That's, I think, a separate question to GDP.
Okay, but I guess there is a question there, isn't there? If we're not really measuring some of those other things, like inequalities or, resilience, happiness. Sorry that a happiness index makes you miserable. But I think there is that sense in which, how can you have good governance? How can you have good policy if you're not actually having some of the evidence that actually influences it? But that's probably another debate. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm going to now ask you in true style. You've got one final kind of wrap-up comment, and I'm going to start with you and go along with it, so that, because she's my boss, I'm going to give her the last word.
Quite right.
So one final kind of things to sort of sum up, or that you want everyone to go away with. So.
Don't concentrate on GDP, don't concentrate on happiness. Spend time trying to develop a complete picture of the economy at every level. Think about the distribution of income, think about regional income, think about income in different areas. Like your temperature, GDP is just one measure of your health. There's a lot of other things you have to look at. So train yourselves to look at it, and if you haven't got the time or the ability, come to the Institute and we'll be happy to help you follow these kinds of things. It's a much more complicated thing.
Okay, what an answer to finish on. Danny, over to you.
I'd like us to think less about income and more about capital and more about assets and how we can capitalize our communities better, how we can actually get real wealth into local places. And so let's think about large-scale transfers of income and more about how we can see real wealth invested in places.
Thank you. Cal?
I'd like to encourage you to be far more demanding of businesses than we're accustomed to be, in all the ways that you can be demanding. For example, most people are shareholders, if only through your pension schemes. Demand of your pension trustees that they demand things of their companies they're invested in. It's only by pressure that companies will respond. Otherwise, they'll take the easy route. And if anyone wants to carry this conversation on afterwards in the pub or somewhere similar, I'm game on.
I think there's some information about the SALT network at the front as well. So, Amanda.
What would I like you to take away? That Britain was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. And that is because people were brave, courageous to come up and test new ideas and new models. I think that I'm not being alarmist when I say that we need new alternatives. So I would say when we talk about profit, let's redefine profit. It shouldn't be about money. Let it be about something else. When we talk about GDP, that, yes, it's true, that's one indicator. But let's come up with other alternatives that mean that we are looking. I really like what, was it Matt, that says economy for the common good rather than economic growth. I think for me, that's my takeaway from this debate. What does an economy and economic models for the common good look like? And what do we need to put in place? Because at the end of the day, what gets measured gets done. So if we continue with the measure of GDP, that's what we're going to focus on. Let's change this.
Well, we could be here for another couple of hours, but unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time. Fantastic contributions from right across our panel, lots and lots of food for thought. And I think your round of applause said it at the end in terms of what we're trying to do, that sense of what are we here for? We're here for human flourishing and also for a sustainable planet. So as Cal has left us ringing in our ears that desire to be more demanding of business, be more demanding of governments and politicians, and be more demanding of our economists, and I think also be more demanding of ourselves in terms of being really out there and committed to find an economy that reflects human flourishing, so that we can truly not just have more, but be more. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you to St. Paul's and the Institute. There's more information about both on your way out, I think, both St. Paul's and Christian Aid. Thank you for being here and braving a cold and rainy night. And please join me in thanking my panel.